When you look at the dynamic between a super empath and an avoidant, what you're really seeing is the collision of two emotional worlds, one built on connection and the other built on protection. The super empath doesn't just feel emotions, they absorb them, interpret them, and respond with an almost instinctive drive to connect. Their nervous system is wired to seek closeness, to read the subtleties in someone's tone, in their silences, in their body language. They experience emotional depth as the baseline of human interaction. For them, vulnerability isn't something to be feared, it's the currency of intimacy. They believe that if they can just love hard enough, understand deeply enough, they can reach the person on the other side of the wall. The avoidant, on the other hand, views that same emotional depth as dangerous territory. To them, vulnerability feels like stepping on a thin ice. They've often learned, sometimes through early experiences of inconsistency, rejection, or enmeshment, that closeness equals risk. So they build walls, they prize autonomy, they detach not because they don't care, but because caring too much feels like a loss of control. Their emotional self-concept is anchored in self-reliance. Needing someone feels like weakness. This is why they can come across as cold, aloof, or even dismissive. Not because they lack emotion, but because they've spent years learning to contain it. Now imagine what happens when these two forces meet. The empath leans in, the avoidant leans out. The empath hears silence and interprets it as pain, something to soothe. The avoidant feels the empath's closeness as pressure, something to escape. To the empath, the avoidant's distance feels like abandonment. To the avoidant, the empath's intensity feels like intrusion. And here's the paradox, both are trying to feel safe. The empath seeks safety through merging while the avoidant seeks it through separation. This is why the relationship becomes so magnetically charged. It's not just about attraction, it's about survival strategies colliding. This polarity is emotionally intoxicating in the beginning. The empath sees mystery and depth in the avoidant's reserve, and they want to unlock it. The avoidant sees warmth and vitality in the empath's openness, and they are drawn to it like a moth to flame. But what starts as fascination often becomes friction. Because over time, the very traits that pulled them together begin to activate each other's deepest fears. The empath's intensity awakens the avoidant's fear of being consumed. The avoidant's distance awakens the empath's fear of being abandoned. They aren't fighting each other so much as they're fighting their own childhood ghosts, projected onto the person in front of them. And this is where most people misunderstand this dynamic. They think it's a simple case of incompatible personalities. It's not. It's a complex dance between two nervous systems with opposite wiring. One hyper-attuned to emotional cues, the other hypersensitive to emotional demands. The empath feels too much, the avoidant feels too threatened, until both understand that they are reacting not to each other, but to their own internal alarm systems. They remain locked in this emotional tug of war. When you understand this, the conflict stops being personal. You stop seeing the avoidant's coldness as rejection and start seeing it as fear. You stop seeing your own emotional intensity as weakness and start seeing it as power that needs direction. The real shift begins the moment the empath recognizes that depth has no power if it's given away to someone who is afraid of it. What makes this dynamic even more volatile is the cycle inevitably creates. The push-pull loop that begins almost imperceptibly but grows until it defines the entire relationship. The super empath by nature is a fixer. They see cracks and instinctively want to mend them. They feel emotional dissonance like static electricity on their skin, and their response is to close the gap, to restore harmony. So when they sense distance from the avoidant, they don't interpret it as a boundary, they interpret it as a wound. They believe if they just pour in more love, more understanding, more effort, they can bring the connection back to life. It's not desperation at first, it's devotion. But devotion quickly morphs into overfunctioning when it goes unreciprocated. On the other side, the avoidant feels that surge of attention not as love but as pressure. Where the empath sees closeness as healing, the avoidant experiences it as suffocating. It's not that they don't want connection, it's that their nervous system has been conditioned to see connection as loss of self. So the more the empath reaches in, the more the avoidant pulls away. And this is where the loop locks in. The empath thinks, they're pulling away, I must not be enough, while the avoidant thinks, they're getting too close, I'm losing control. One is scrambling to be more while the other is scrambling to be free. This cycle feeds on itself. The empath, desperate to restore connection, begins to abandon their own needs. They silence their intuition, dismiss their hurt, and work harder to please. They start monitoring every word, every text, every silence, analyzing it for hidden meaning. Meanwhile, the avoidant, feeling increasingly engulfed, creates even more distance. Delaying responses, avoiding emotional conversations, retreating into work or solitude. To the empath, this feels like punishment. To the avoidant, it feels like survival. Each person's behavior confirms the other's fear. The empath feels abandonment and feels abandoned. The avoidant fears engulfment and feels engulfed. And here's the deeper truth. This isn't about love. It's about regulation. Both are trying to regulate their nervous systems through the other person. The empath is trying to soothe their anxiety by securing the bond. The avoidant is trying to soothe their fear by weakening the bond. That's why logic doesn't break the cycle. You can't rationalize someone out of a trauma response. Until both people become aware of what's actually driving their behavior, they're not choosing, they're reacting. The empath especially often takes this on as a personal failure. They believe if they were more patient, more attractive, more emotionally available, they could win the avoidance trust. But what they don't see is that the harder they chase, the more they reinforce the avoidance fear that closeness means losing their freedom. It becomes a paradox. The empath's love starts to feel like pressure, and the avoidance distance starts to feel like power. This imbalance erodes the relationship from the inside out. Breaking this pattern requires the empath to do something completely counterintuitive, to stop trying, to stop managing the other person's emotional state and start reclaiming their own. That's where the power begins to shift. Because when the empath pulls their energy back, they break the cycle. They disrupt the loop that says, I will lose myself to keep you. And when that loop breaks, something profound happens. The avoidant is left alone with the silence they once craved. And for the first time, they have to decide if they're willing to step forward on their own. At the heart of this dynamic lies something far more profound than behavior. It's identity. What makes the super empath and the avoidant clash so intensely isn't just their actions toward each other, but the stories they've built about who they must be to survive emotionally. The empath has often learned, very early, that love is earned through giving, by anticipating others' needs, by becoming indispensable, by being the emotional anchor in chaotic environments. So their self-worth becomes woven into the act of caretaking. They don't just want to be loved. They need to be needed because being needed makes them feel real. When the avoidant pulls away, it doesn't just sting. It threatens the very foundation of who the empath believes they are. The avoidant carries a different wound, but one just as deep. For them, closeness has often been tangled with disappointment, unpredictability, or control. Maybe they learned that relying on others leads to rejection, or that being emotionally open invites criticism or engulfment. So they internalize a belief that says, if I depend on no one, I can't be hurt. Their identity becomes fused with autonomy. They're not just protecting their space. They're protecting the core of how they define themselves. So when the empath leans in, it doesn't just feel like affection, it feels like a threat to their emotional survival. The avoidant isn't pushing away the person, they're pushing away the possibility of losing themselves. This is where the relationship becomes a mirror that reflects back each person's deepest fear. The empath sees distance and thinks, I'm not enough, which drives them to give even more of themselves, erasing their boundaries in the process. The avoidant sees intensity and thinks, I'm being consumed, which drives them to retreat even further, reinforcing their walls. Each person's behavior validates the other's internal belief. The empath believes they must prove their worth, and the avoidant believes they must protect their independence. It's not about love. It's about survival strategies playing out as love. And what makes this dynamic so painful is that neither person is wrong. These strategies were born from real emotional wounds. They were brilliant solutions for children trying to survive unpredictable love. But what kept them safe back then now keeps them stuck as adults. The empath's overgiving keeps them from ever feeling truly chosen, and the avoidance detachment keeps them from ever feeling truly seen. They are both starving for the same thing, secure connection, but trying to get it through opposite means. One chases love to prove they're worthy of it. The other outruns love to avoid being destroyed by it. And neither realizes they are both living out the fears of their past in the present moment. This is why healing this pattern isn't about fixing the other person. It's about reclaiming your identity from the roles you learned to play. The empath has to confront the fear that they are lovable, even when they're not saving anyone. The avoidant has to confront the fear that vulnerability doesn't erase their autonomy. That's the inner battle between the part of you that's terrified to lose love and the part of you that's terrified to need it. And the only way out is to stop fighting each other and start facing yourselves. The final piece in this dynamic, and maybe the most transformative, is the realization that the super empath's power was never meant to be spent on convincing the avoidant to change. Because at some point, what starts as compassion turns into self-erasure. The empath keeps showing up with open hands, thinking love can thaw the ice, while the avoidant keeps stepping back, mistaking warmth for danger. And in that space, the empath slowly loses sight of themselves. They forget that empathy is a gift, not a currency. When your sense of worth becomes tied to whether or not someone lets you heal them, you're no longer loving, you're bargaining. And the tragedy is, the empath doesn't see that the more they bargain, the less valuable their love becomes in the eyes of the avoidant, who only understands scarcity. The avoidant respects what they have to reach for, not what is endlessly given without boundaries. The shift comes the moment the empath recognizes that their depth is not meant to be consumed by someone running from depth. It's meant to be shared with someone who can meet it. And that requires a radical shift from external focus to internal anchoring. Instead of trying to decode the avoidance moods, silences, or inconsistencies, the empath begins decoding their own patterns, asking, why do I keep trying to prove I'm worthy to someone who refuses to receive me? That question cuts through the illusion, because it reframes the entire struggle. It's not about winning someone's love, it's about reclaiming your own. When the empath pulls their energy back, not in anger but in clarity, they stop feeding the dynamic that keeps both people trapped. They break the emotional economy where they give and the avoidant withholds. This is where the power balance flips. The avoidant, who once held control through detachment, is now faced with the void they used to run toward. And it's here that something profound happens if the avoidant ever does choose to step forward. It's not because they were chased or convinced. It's because they finally want to. And if they don't, the empath no longer collapses. Because their worth is no longer tethered to someone else's fear. This is not about becoming cold or detached yourself. It's about learning the difference between love and self-abandonment. Real empathy doesn't mean absorbing someone's pain at the cost of your peace. It means holding space without losing your center. It means knowing that your heart is not an emergency room for those who refuse to heal. The greatest act of love an empath can offer an avoidant is to stop participating in the pattern, to stop making it safe for the avoidant to stay unsafe, because only then does the dynamic lose its grip. Only then does the empath's energy become magnetic rather than draining, sovereign rather than sacrificial. And that's the ultimate transformation, not turning your heart off, but turning it inward first. Because when you stop trying to rescue someone from their fear of love, you stop drowning in it yourself. And the moment you stand fully rooted in your own worth, you stop needing anyone to come closer just to prove that you matter.